The Stronger by Science channel. We are here with esteemed guest slash fellow real doctor, Dr. Eric Helms, PhD doctorate holder, talk about bulking. Bulking and whether it's dead. Now, I'll preface this by saying, traditionally, bodybuilders and even strength athletes to a certain extent, or at least used to, do phases of bulking, sometimes more aggressive than others. And you'd hear a lot of, bodybuilders, enhanced and not, supporting the idea that you need to gain massive or at least significant amounts of body weight during a period of a few months in order to actually maximize muscle gain. But when we look at the current literature, and you're somebody who's looked at the literature both from an overview perspective with a classic paper that you are a co-author on called Is an Energy Surplus Required to Maximize Muscle Building? But also you recently published a study in which you were the first author that looked specifically at a different surplus.
Bulking and cutting is actually an artifact of competitive bodybuilding because you don't have an option as a competitive bodybuilder to do anything except bulk and cut because you are required to get on stage shredded. So that means you are required to diet down to an unsustainable level of body fat, which means you're therefore required to put back on a certain level of body fat just to get back into a position where you're hormonally functioning and relatively normal and able to still live life. So because bodybuilders are seen as the archetypes of muscularity and the people who know how to build muscle and get shredded and produce the best body composition, they're emulated in a lot of ways. And even the bodybuilders themselves will promote their own methods as the best way to approach it because they're the best way to approach it in the context of the sport of bodybuilding, but not necessarily if your goal was just to maximize hypertrophy over your entire lifting career. Mm-hmm. Because bodybuilders typically lose some degree of muscle mass getting into shredded condition, or at the very least, they're hitting pause on their muscle building potential and creating a less than ideal environment for building muscle when they compete, ironically, when they look their best. So if you wanted to say, hey, are bodybuilders actually the best archetype for building muscle? Technically not, because when they go through contest prep, they're actually doing something directly counterproductive to it. Mm-hmm. There is typically a point for most people where they start to look less muscular with muscle gain if it comes with fat past a certain point. Mm-hmm. So most people, and I think this should be their personal preference, will hit some point either aesthetically or maybe what they're comfortable with as far as health or performance, but they don't necessarily need to look like that of a bodybuilder. One of the very first studies that came out on quote-unquote bulking was done by Rosnick and colleagues in 2002. And this study basically came out and the bros would have been like, I told you were right. You got to go on the seafood diet. That's SEE. You see the food, you eat it. Go hard, go home. Eat big to get big. Let's go. Dave Tate. Writing on, good old T-Nation. Large pizza, pour olive oil on it, choke it down, you're going to be huge. This study specifically took untrained young university-aged males. They gave them essentially a weight gainer. 2,000 calories on top of their habitual diet. So one of them, it was protein and maltodextrin, so basically carbs and protein. The other group, pure carbs, just maltodextrin. 2,000 calories of basically sugar. And then the final group was just following their habitual diet. What's crazy is they gained 3 kilos of body mass in both surplus groups that got the 2,000 calories of maltodextrin or the 2,000 calories of maltodextrin plus protein week for the whole 8-week study of pure lean body mass from throwing down an additional 2,000 calories of straight sugar in one of these groups. That shows you how powerful the initial training stimulus is when you're untrained, that they didn't even have a protein shake. Macronutrients didn't matter. There's a huge energy demand. The control group gained about half as much lean body mass as the two groups that were actually increasing their calories by 2,000. Mm-hmm. And what's crazy is just how powerful resistance training and stimulus is when you're untrained. They also lost, on average, about 1 kilogram of fat mass. One, you can actually build muscle in a deficit. So an untrained individual is going to make great gains no matter what, even in a less than ideal nutritional circumstance. But if your goal is maximizing muscle gain, then you want to be in a big surplus. The unfortunate thing, though, is that not only in the subsequent research that was done by Garth and colleagues in 2013, but also the one that you referenced that we did 10 years after that, publishing it last year, we found this is not the case in well-trained individuals. Obviously, your growth potential slows down, and we have this logarithmic curve that is unfavorable. Basically, if you try to force feed this process, you don't actually accelerate the process, you just gain more fat mass. This is observed by Garth and colleagues in not super well resistance trained athletes, but elite level athletes from multiple different sports codes who had strength conditioning experience with no significant difference between groups in lean mass gained or changes in strength. We observed something similar targeting specifically well-trained resistance-trained athletes back last year. We tried to, an analogy I like to use is that if your nutrition is the soil, if it's the sun, if it's the water, the seed is training. But if you don't have a seed, nothing will grow. So ultimately, what people need to understand is that you can't force feed your gains. And these data suggest that if you have a really, really good program, you can probably benefit from having a larger surplus because there's a more growth potential. But if the growth potential isn't there, then those calories have to go somewhere. If you don't have a training program that is well set up to maximize the potential for building muscle, putting yourself into a surplus is not going to go well. Then the second thing to consider is what's your growth potential? And if you've only been in the gym for 6 weeks, it's going to be a lot higher than if you've been in the gym for 6 years. Because it's going to vary tremendously between individuals. We do have the theoretical backing to say that you probably want to scale your surplus size inversely to your training experience. Meaning you'll probably benefit from being in a large surplus. And I think you could reasonably put yourself in a 10 or even 20% calorie surplus. Once you're an intermediate level lifter, once you're an advanced level lifter, I think you want to start cutting that down pretty substantially. And now we're talking about a 5 to 10% calorie surplus. An ideal training program as best as you can, informed by the evidence.
What about main gaining? The idea of staying on maintenance calories.
A 2021 meta-regression that was done by Murphy that found, yeah, you can absolutely build muscle in a deficit until you're in, like, say, a 500 calorie deficit. And at that point, on average, do people start to see no hypertrophy. But it's certainly true that if you are close to maintenance, you should be able to make gains, especially if you have a strong stimulus and a high growth potential. And I think there's nothing wrong with it. And if you highly value trying to maintain a certain level of body fat that's within a reasonable range, that's certainly fine. And if you are okay with potentially shortcutting your gains a little bit, more power to you. I think probably a better approach that might be more efficient is just trying to make sure that you're in a very small surplus.
Is bulking dead?
I would say that bulking is alive and well for those new to lifting. But going back to bulking, I think you can call it bulking, but in reality, it's probably something a little more like lean gaining.
So the old idea, in the classic pictures of Lee Priest and Jay Cutler, there's one of Ronnie Coleman as well, where they look, morbidly obese. The idea that you need to get to that stage in order to actually look amazing or on stage or after you do your cut or whatever, that doesn't hold much value, much truth, at least for non-enhanced, natural individuals who look to maximize muscle.
Yeah, one more historical thing is that when bulking got popularized, it was an era where many of the thought leaders were from the enhanced ranks of both bodybuilding and powerlifting. And it consisted largely of enhanced super heavyweight powerlifters.
Yes.
And it also consisted largely of IFBB pros.
Yes.
If you're not running copious amounts of anabolic steroids, or if you are not a super heavyweight who actually doesn't care how much body fat you put on, that extra body fat might actually just stretch my multiply bench press shirt or squat suit a little bit and give me some more poundage. If that's not you, maybe that shouldn't be the most appropriate advice.